She showed up in a blood-stained scrub top? The question was whispered, no, emailed, early that Monday morning among courthouse staff at Oak Ridge County Court, and the answer was yes. Simone Hayes, an emergency room nurse and single mother of two, walked into a custody hearing wearing the same uniform she'd worn through the night. There was dried blood on her sleeve. Dust from hospital corridors still clung to her shoes. And in her eyes, a kind of silence you only earn after a night where no one slept and someone almost didn't wake up. But what startled the courtroom wasn't the shirt. It was the way she walked in. No apologies, no excuses. She didn't lower her head. She didn't hide behind paperwork or a lawyer. She stepped forward like someone who'd come from a battlefield. Not as a victim, but as someone who still had breath left to testify. 7 hours later, a 38-second clip showing the judge scolding her over her inappropriate attire had crossed 1 million views online. But no one watching that clip knew they were witnessing the overture of something much bigger. A quiet unmasking, a story no one expected to be center stage for. It was 9 a.m. The courtroom felt more like a surgical suite, cold, sterile, lit with a harsh, clinical brightness. The wooden benches gleamed with polish, reflecting that light onto every face like a test for flaws. And then Simone Hayes walked in. There was no announcement, no lawyer escort, no dramatic entrance. Just a black woman in wrinkled gray scrubs, a faint red stain on her left sleeve, walking with the unhurried cadence of someone who had crossed too many hospital hallways to flinch now. People turned. First, they noticed the scent of antiseptic and exhaustion. Then the messy hair, tied up with a rubber band. And finally, those eyes. Not asking for sympathy, not even asking to be understood. Just present. Judge Harper Grayson, white 62, silver hair pinned like a crown, looked up from her docket. Her voice was colder than the AC humming behind her. Ms. Hayes, this is a court of law, not a trauma bay. Please show the appropriate respect. No one responded. The clerk paused mid-scribble. Thomas Grant, Simone's ex-husband, the plaintiff, adjusted his ivory shirt and navy tie with calm precision. He looked like he'd stepped out of a brochure for fathers who care. Simone blinked once. She didn't argue, didn't smooth her hair. Her voice came low, even and perfectly measured. Each word like a pulse she'd fought to keep steady through the night. Your Honor, I left the hospital at 8:12 a.m. A 7-year-old boy stopped breathing. I was the only nurse still on duty. Her tone wasn't defiant, nor was it pleading. It was so matter-of-fact, it made the accusations that followed sound rehearsed. Harper narrowed her eyes. Let's keep emotions out of this. This is a courtroom, not a theater for self-sacrifice. Simone tilted her head ever so slightly. Her shoulders didn't drop. Her gaze didn't waver. And then, after a breath not meant to calm, but to compress every moment she'd been called, too poor, too tired, too late, she said, I chose to keep a child breathing. I didn't get to change shirts. The courtroom fell into silence, not because her voice had risen, but because it didn't have to. Noon, second floor, conference room. The blinds were drawn tight, soundproof windows, no cameras, just 4 people in the room. Judge Harper Grayson, prosecutor Gerald Moss, the lead attorney from Oak Ridge's Civil Oversight Office, and a legal advisor from the district. The table held neatly clipped case files. No one hit a record. And if someone had, no one would have dared play it back. Harper opened the meeting with a sentence that needed no preamble. We can't let women like her set a precedent. No one asked who women like her meant. They understood. Moss nodded, flipping through a color-coded chart pulled from the Department of Family and Welfare. Women of color are 3 times more likely to be flagged as parentally unfit, especially those working night shifts, on Medicaid, or never remarried. Harper cut in without looking up. Her tone was flat, drained of all pretense. In other words, the kind this system never learned how to look at without suspicion. On the large screen, the advisor pulled up the last 3 custody rulings. A janitor, mother of 2, lost custody for excessive absenteeism. A nurse accused of postpartum instability. a hairdresser labeled domestically unanchored for being single and not owning property. They were all black. None had criminal records, and none fit the template of the ideal mother, the kind someone, somewhere, once outlined with bullet points and clean margins. Harper opened the next file, Simone Hayes. It read like a checklist, not of her life, but of every box society had used to disqualify her. Single mother, emergency room nurse, night shift worker, no co-owned property, previous recipient of temporary food assistance. Nowhere did it say how many lives she had saved. No one had noted the time she split her sandwich with a nervous intern on their first day. Systems don't measure dedication. They count absences, they score risk, they sort. Like inventory. Moss read aloud from an old statistical report, as if to prove a point he already knew was flawed. Pregnant black women show higher risk for behavioral issues, elevated substance use, limited prenatal care. The advisor looked up, calm but pointed. Do we have evidence? Not to argue, just to know what excuses they'd need if someone ever pushed back. Harper shook her head. No hesitation. Administrative assumption, but good enough. The air in the courtroom felt thicker after the lunch recess. Not because the temperature had changed, but because something in the way people looked at Simone had. It was subtle, a shift. As if, after that morning's testimony, the room had stopped seeing her as just a defendant and started recognizing her as a question the entire system wasn't prepared to answer. Simone walked to the witness stand. No one called her name, but the room instinctively paused the moment she stood upright, hands lightly clasped at her waist, not trembling, not defensive, just steady. Your Honor, she began, her voice low and even, like she was speaking to herself first. I know I don't look like what most people picture as an ideal mother. I'm not home for dinner every night. I don't have pictures from PTA meetings. I don't own a house on a quiet street or a savings account with 3 zeros. She took a breath, not for courage, but to stop the memories from rushing out too fast. I learned to change diapers with one hand, she continued, because the other was bruised after I was pushed into the corner of a kitchen table when I was 8 months pregnant. I worked 14 night shifts in 3 weeks just to afford a small apartment with a space heater because my oldest has asthma and cold air makes her choke. No one interrupted, but some people leaned forward, not because they hadn't heard her, but because they could feel she was saying things she had never planned to say aloud. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, she said, her voice still calm, still controlled. I'm saying it because no one ever asked. No one ever asked how I made it here, with both of my kids still whole, without one single person standing between us and everything trying to take them away. Then she looked directly at Judge Harper, for the first time since the hearing began. Not with challenges, not with submission, just a quiet, steady gaze, the kind a person carries after surviving something worse than judgment, being treated like they never existed. Has anyone ever asked why I haven't fallen apart? In that moment, the oxygen seemed to leave the room, not because her words were loud, but because they didn't have to be. Because some battles don't leave bruises you can see, but they scare you just the same. In the gallery, a young nurse, braids tucked into a lavender uniform, wiped the corner of her eye. She'd worked a few shifts with Simone before. She remembered how Simone was always the first to volunteer when a new trainee needed help. Always took the night shift. Always gave up lunch breaks. Always stayed quiet when supervisors warned her about her lack of work-life balance. And now she understood why. Simone had never asked to be heard. She had earned the right to be, by showing up, by not collapsing, by surviving in a system never designed for someone like her to even reach the witness stand. A day after Simone's testimony, the courtroom still held the same charged silence. No one said it aloud, but nearly everyone could feel it. What was on trial now wasn't just a mother. It was the way the entire system had looked at and failed to see people like her. Your Honor, we request to submit new evidence, said Matt, Simone's attorney, standing with a voice that wasn't loud, but rang with quiet certainty. He placed a small USB drive on the table. It made no sound, but the hush that followed was so deep you could hear the rustle of someone's coat 2 rows back. This is security footage pulled from the ER at St. Joseph's Hospital. Timestamp, 4:03 a.m., March 17th, the exact time Ms. Simone Hayes was accused of being absent from caring for her children. The projector flickered on. A sterile white hallway came into view, lit by fluorescent lights. You could hear the background chorus of beeping monitors and rushed footsteps. A young boy, unconscious, was being wheeled in on a stretcher. And then, Simone appeared. No hesitation, no instructions. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, hands already moving into position. Steady, precise chest compressions. A doctor stepped forward, but Simone shook her head, and she kept going, beat after beat, as if it wasn't just a heartbeat she was trying to restore, but the right to be seen for who she really was. The clip ended at the 3-minute mark. The child's pulse had returned. No one applauded. No one even nodded. But what settled in the room was undeniable. Every label thrown at her, every assumption, every whispered judgment, felt hollow now, emptied out by the unshakable reality on that screen. Judge Harper sat frozen, her right hand tapping faintly on the desk, a small habit that betrayed a growing unease. She didn't have a chance to speak before the opposing counsel rose. Leon Grant stood calmly, his voice smooth but tinged with defensive urgency. Your Honor, while the defendant's actions that morning are commendable, they do not establish a direct link to her parental capacity. This is a separate matter entirely. Simone didn't turn. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward, placed a thin folder on the wooden table, and opened to the first page. A printed police report dated October 4th, 2020. Victim, Simone Hayes, 7 months pregnant. Suspect, Thomas Grant. Charge, domestic violence. Harper frowned. This document wasn't part of the original file, Matt responded immediately. No, Your Honor. The record was reclassified as irrelevant to present circumstances, per recommendation from the Preliminary Review Board. Leon Grant raised a hand. Your Honor, this is a distraction. That incident occurred 3 years ago. It cannot be used to imply present danger posed by my client. Simone said nothing. She didn't need to. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked straight at the live stream camera mounted in the far corner, where thousands were now watching what they thought had started as a routine custody case. And then, in a voice low but clear, as if she were making a promise that no one had ever let her make before, she said, I'm not showing this so the court will believe me. I'm showing this so the court will see me. And if you still don't recognize me, maybe it's because you've never truly looked. Less than 24 hours after the video of Simone resuscitating a child went viral on local social media, another car pulled into the Oak Ridge County Courthouse parking lot. It wasn't a blacked-out SUV, no diplomatic plates, just a silver gray sedan, dust coating half the chassis, with scratch marks on the license plate, likely from loose gravel on the interstate. The door opened. A woman stepped out. Jasmine Crockett, hair neatly pinned, wearing a textured gray blazer, carrying a thick file of documents no one could quite identify. She didn't rush, but she didn't hesitate either. Each step hit the pavement with the weight of a gavel, as if the courtroom inside had been waiting for this reckoning all along. There were no reporters, no flashing lights, no murmurs of recognition. But from the moment she climbed the courthouse steps, the air seemed to shift, as if this building, so used to quiet compliance, had just heard a door creak open that no one had dared touch in years. Inside, Judge Harper was reviewing her case notes. Leon Grant scribbled something hurriedly into his legal pad, while Thomas Grant adjusted his collar again, casting a sideways glance toward the door, trying to gauge whether the message he'd received earlier now required real worry. The door opened. Jasmine didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the counsel's table, presented her credentials from the Federal Civil Rights Office to the clerk, and then stood still. No microphone, no raised voice, no theater. My name is Jasmine Crockett, she said. I'm not here to represent a party. I didn't come with a slogan, and I'm certainly not here to save anyone. Her gaze passed calmly over Harper. Not accusatory, but deliberate. Like the needle of a compass that had finally settled, pointing directly towards something long ignored. I was once a child nobody picked. I know what it feels like to sit at the edge of the world and wait while strangers decide if you're worth keeping. Today, I'm standing with the ones who get left out, not to help them win, but to make sure for once they don't get silenced. A woman in the fourth row clutched her hands in her lap. Her eyes glistened. Jasmine turned to the court clerk. I'm requesting a 48-hour recess to gather all records of custody rulings from the past 3 years where the phrase unfit to parent was used, and to cross-check any cases dismissed on grounds of instability without an independent hearing. Judge Harper leaned her elbows onto the bench. She said nothing, but for the first time since the proceedings began, people noticed her fingers curling beneath the desk. Not to pick up a pen, but in the subtle reflex of someone calculating how to retreat without surrendering the stage. Leon Grant flipped through his notes faster. Thomas Grant kept his eyes on the table. The model father look he wore on day one had started to crack. After the 48-hour recess was granted, Jasmine didn't leave Oak Ridge. She stayed. For the next 2 days, the lights in the makeshift records office, a borrowed auditorium down the hall, stayed on until 3 a.m. Every line of every file, every phrase in every old transcript, every blurred word in archived memos. Nothing was skipped, and when Jasmine returned to the courtroom 2 days later, she didn't bring a slogan. She didn't come with cameras or crowds, just a slim silver USB drive and a neatly bound stack of documents. Your Honor, she began, voice steady, what I'm presenting today isn't speculation. This is an internal recording from a meeting held at the County Judicial Strategy Office this past February. She nodded toward the clerk. The speaker system clicked on, and then a voice, clear, familiar, unmistakable. We can't let poor black mothers start winning. All it takes is one case breaking the line, and we lose the standard. It unravels. The tone wasn't angry. It didn't have to be. Each word landed with practiced conviction. No one in the courtroom needed to be told whose voice it was. Harper stayed seated. Her eyes never left the folder in front of her. She didn't explain, didn't interrupt, didn't deny. Jasmine gave the smallest of nods, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. The conversation had officially shifted. This wasn't a legal dispute anymore. It was a reckoning. She continued, her voice lower but firm. Along with the audio, we obtained a budget ledger from the Family Justice Fund, managed by Mrs. Marlene Holloway, the mayor's wife. She flipped to the first page of a color-printed spreadsheet. The title read, Priority A Legal Assistance Allocations, Custody Cases, 2020 to 2024, 14 cases listed. 12 had ended with custody awarded to the father. In 9 of those, the mother was a woman of color with income below the state minimum. In 6, requests for legal aid from the mother's side had been denied, with no documented reason. Jasmine paused, then said the next line slowly, every syllable deliberate. Thomas Grant, listed as a beneficiary in 2 separate cases, 2021 and 2022, was flagged as priority handling. His case files were fast-tracked to the Strategic Legal Advisory Unit. All eyes turned toward the plaintiff's table. Thomas still sat upright, but his right hand gripped the edge of the table just a little too tightly. Jasmine didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. She closed the folder and finished with a single sentence. Not everyone gets protected by the law, but clearly, some are programmed to win. The slow-burning outrage from earlier hearings had smoldered long enough, but it wasn't until today when voices stepped down from the legal bench and into the memories of those who owed Simone not a debt, but a life. That emotion finally spilled over the edge of the courtroom. Dr. Leah Morales, Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Joseph's Hospital, took the witness stand. She held no papers, didn't glance at a single note. She stood tall, hands gently folded, face bare of makeup. But the fine lines around her eyes read like silent transcripts of hundreds of sleepless nights inside trauma bays. Simone Hayes, she began, was the only one on our entire team who never took her hands off Oliver Banks during those 19 minutes of resuscitation. The room fell quiet. the kind of quiet that doesn't come from shock, but from recognition. The automatic chest compressor jammed. The monitor lost signal. The attending physicians paused, waiting for replacement equipment. But Simone didn't wait. She used her own two hands and kept pressing that child's chest second by second without a break. Dr. Morales swallowed once, then reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a pale yellow envelope. No stamp, no return address. The patient's family asked me to read this. Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes blinked faster than usual. To the woman in gray scrubs, we don't know your name. We only remember your wet hands, your messy hair, and the blood on your forehead. Blood that wasn't yours. If you had gone home to change clothes that morning, our son wouldn't have survived. We can't tell the court whether you're a good mother. But we know this. Anyone who can keep a child breathing through the night deserves to keep their own. No one spoke. No one needed to. Simone sat still. She didn't nod, didn't bow her head. She pressed her hands into her thighs, not to hold back tears, but to anchor herself in the moment, to remind herself she was real. She was here, and this time she wasn't being erased. 1 minute passed. It felt as long as her entire motherhood, quiet, unseen, unrecognized. And then from the back row, the place where people usually sat out of curiosity, not care, an older man slowly stood. His eyes were cloudy with age, but his voice rang out like a cane striking concrete. Sharp, deliberate, unshakable. Your Honor, I don't know her, he said, but I was once a man whose heart stopped, and a nurse kept pressing down, even when I vomited on her uniform. He turned toward Simone. His tone held no drama, no trembling emotion. I don't remember that nurse's face, but if it was hers, thank you. And I believe that anyone who's ever kept someone breathing through the night is someone who deserves to be a mother. Inside the courtroom, Simone sat upright. Her hands were no longer clenched. Her eyes didn't cast downward. She looked straight toward the bench, not in anticipation, but because today silence no longer frightened her. Harper sat at the highest seat. Her hair is still perfectly pinned. Her judicial robe is still without a crease. But in the moment Jasmine stood and turned her gaze toward her, the entire room sank into a hush, one heavier than any gavel ever dropped. I'm not asking for a new verdict, Jasmine began. I'm asking for a moment of reckoning, from the very person who once read a judgment based on a file she knew was incomplete. Harper raised her head. Her eyes met Jasmine's. No longer defiant, but not fully remorseful either. It was the look of someone who had once believed she couldn't be wrong, and now understood that belief itself had caused harm. She opened the case file in front of her, quietly, slowly, reading each line, each word, like they were indictments of a system she had once trusted to be neutral. And then Harper spoke. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't waver, but it was slow and clear enough that everyone knew these weren't lines she had rehearsed. This court, for years, has used the standard of financial, emotional, and environmental stability as an objective benchmark. But we can no longer deny that these so-called standards have been applied in a way that systematically excludes those who don't fit the mold, particularly single mothers of color in non-traditional professions. Today, the court withdrew all prior statements asserting that Ms. Simone Hayes was unfit to parent. We recognize her capacity to care, her sacrifice, and her resilience, which far exceed any administrative checklist. No one moved. This court formally grants Ms. Hayes full custody of her children, without oversight and without future reassessment during annual reviews. Simone didn't cry. She simply exhaled, like she was finally releasing an invisible belt that had been wrapped too tightly around her chest for far too long. But Harper wasn't finished. And based on the evidence that has come to light in recent days, I accept the proposal from Advisor Crockett to reopen 12 prior custody cases suspected of applying discriminatory criteria over the past 3 years. Furthermore, this court recommends that the Office of Judicial Oversight establish an independent review body to reassess how we define fitness to parent, especially in matters of income, work schedules, and personal image. Simone stood as the verdict was read. She didn't lean forward. She didn't press her lips together like someone bracing for another blow. She simply stood, like a tree that had weathered storms, its roots never once pulled from the ground. The court acknowledges, Harper said, her voice steady, no longer from a height, but from a place closer to human, that Ms. Simone Hayes, after a complete review of her case, is found fully capable, responsible, and fit to retain sole custody of her two minor children without restriction. She closed the file and set her pen down. A small motion, but inside it, something deep had cracked open. Harper didn't look at Simone. She didn't look at Jasmine either. She stared straight ahead, into the space just beyond the bench, as if seeing, perhaps for the first time, something in herself she had spent years refusing to name. And finally, she said more slowly now, based on the proceedings and revelations brought forth in this courtroom, the Judicial Oversight Committee recommends an inquiry into my own conduct to determine whether administrative standards were applied unjustly in my handling of previous cases. No one smirked. No one nodded. But in the eyes of a few sitting at the back, there was something quiet and unmistakable. Recognition. Not for Harper herself, but for the act of facing something, even when it's too late to undo what's already been done. Thomas Grant left the courtroom without a word. No lawyer beside him, no tie, no polished persona of the model father. Just a man, shoulders sagged, walking away like someone who hadn't lost a case, but had finally realized he couldn't keep hiding behind a version of himself he'd carefully constructed. Simone didn't turn to watch him go. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she didn't need her story validated. Because the truth had finally been recorded, not in someone else's words, but through the life she had fought to live. Outside the courthouse, the sun had begun to warm the pavement. Aria, Simone's eldest daughter, sat beneath a small tree, her backpack hugged against her knees, eyes fixed on the door. When she saw her mother step outside, she didn't run. She stood, walked, reached for her mother's hand. "So, you get to stay with us?" Simone squeezed her daughter's hand. She didn't say, "We won." She didn't say, "It's over." She just smiled. "No one can separate us now. That's all that matters." A week later, the headlines had moved on. The breaking news tickers now blinked toward an upcoming election. The hashtags had faded from trending lists. And Simone Hayes returned to work. She still worked the night shift, still wore the same faded gray scrubs, still tied her hair back with a thin rubber band and stepped into shoes with worn-down soles. To anyone passing by, she looked exactly the same. But something had changed, not in what she wore, but in how people looked at her. No longer just a blur in the hallway, no longer unseen. That Friday afternoon after her shift, Simone picked up Aria from school. They walked together under a row of oak trees, their fallen leaves scattering across sun-warmed bricks. The late sunlight dusted their shadows in gold. Aria stopped. She looked up at her mother, hesitated for a moment, then asked, her voice lower than usual, like she was asking something she wasn't quite old enough to understand. "So, does that mean you won?" Simone paused. A beam of sunlight slipped through the branches and touched her cheek, like time itself was brushing against her, gently, after nearly breaking her. She didn't answer right away. She just took Aria's hand. They walked a few more steps, and then, softly and just loud enough for her daughter to hear, and for herself to believe, she said, "No, baby, I didn't win. I just finally stopped being invisible." The next day at St. Joseph's Hospital, in the corridor that led to the emergency ward, a new plaque appeared on the wall. It wasn't a dedication. It didn't list accomplishments. There was no name engraved, just one line, etched in quiet white steel, resting between two frame group photos. No spotlight. No flowers. Dedication doesn't require a uniform. It just needs a face. No one knew who wrote it. But ever since it went up, young doctors passing by began to slow down. Some medical students scribbled it into their notebooks. And those who had ever been held by Simone's hands in the middle of a crisis, they already knew. They hadn't survived because of a title. They'd survived because someone refused to let go, because someone believed in breath, even when no one else was watching. She didn't need to be remembered by name. But in the end, after everything, She had finally been seen.